Good evening. Welcome to the Duke Endowment. It is our sincere pleasure to host tonight's lecture in the Neil Ask series. Chris William, executive producer and moderator of the PBS television program Carolina Business Review, and also an executive with Wells Fargo for over 30 years, will serve as our very capable moderator, and he will introduce our distinguished guest in just a few minutes. But before that, I would like to say a few words about Neil Williams, and I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Minor Shaw, chairman of the Duke Endowment. Neil Ask honors the legacy of L. Neil Williams, Jr. Neil was widely known for his insight and also his intellect. He was a champion of the arts, higher education, religion, law, and business. Neil was a personification of service and leadership, traits that he shared boldly and selflessly with numerous organizations. He was elected a trustee of the Duke Endowment on June 3rd, 1997, and served as our chairman from January 2011 until the time of his death on August the 26th, 2012. We are especially pleased that 4 members of Neil's family are with us tonight, and I would like to take just a minute to recognize them. His wife, Sue Williams, is here. Sue. His daughter, Susan. His sister, Sue Keith.
Oh, wow.
There you are. You're out of one. And his brother-in-law, Robert Sigmund. There you go. Okay.
And his brother-in-law, Neil Sigmund.
And his brother-in-law, Neil Sigmund, right? There you go. 5 members of the Williams family. So thank you all very much for being here tonight. And I thank all of you in the audience for being here. I know it's a rainy night, and we're all out here out of our love for Neil Williams and his family. I would like to invite now Susan Williams up to the podium. As you know, Susan is Neil's daughter, and Susan is going to tell you a little bit more about her father and also this lecture series. Susan is the Vice Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor of American Literature at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Please help me welcome Susan. Susan.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you in this beautiful space, which I know my dad would have loved, and it's just great to be here. I did want first to start with talking about my family, but we've already been mentioned that my family's here, but I just want to say how much it means to all of us in the Williams family that the Duke Endowment has been so gracious in hosting this, so I want to thank you on behalf of all of my family. Neil Ask started really right after my dad's memorial service when my family was sitting around thinking, what do we want to do to continue some of the many ideas and sort of the legacy of my dad? And we thought about having a lecture series that would be shared among many of the organizations that my dad was involved with. And that's a pretty long list. It turns out that we've had 6 of these. This is the 6th, and we're not done yet with the number of organizations that he was involved in that include his law firm. It includes arts organizations in Atlanta, Georgia. It includes the Duke Law School, the Duke Endowment. We are really glad that all of these organizations have come together. But what we wanted to do in Neil Asks was to think about the way that my dad was willing to ask large questions and really get conversation about them, and to continue that in 2 ways. One is to have events like this where people are really gathered in real time talking and having dialogue about important questions, and I'm really eager to hear what we're going to hear about tonight. And the other is to also have this recorded and then be available at neilask.org to encourage others to have the conversation beyond us. And we really know that that kind of influence will continue in ways we may not anticipate. But neilask.org does have all of the previous lectures up, and any of you are willing to go or invited to go at any point to go see that particular website and to really understand what we've been about for the past couple years in doing Neil Asks. So really what we hope is that you will enjoy thinking about an important question on this rainy night, and that you will then continue to think about it and maybe write about it or talk to other colleagues, which is really what my dad did on a continuing basis. And that's the main thing that we're trying to accomplish with Neil Asks. Before I sit down, I did want to say one word about the Duke Endowment and to thank you so much for hosting this in this beautiful space. My dad did get to think about the plans for this building, and I know he would be really thrilled to see the people here. Also to know that in the clouds somewhere is the steeple of Covenant Presbyterian Church, which is the church he grew up in. My dad was born in Charlotte and grew up here, so it's really wonderful to be in Charlotte. And the Duke Endowment, as was mentioned, was important to him. He was a member of it and then was the chair. And I really want to say as his daughter that it was one of the few institutions that he was associated with that I really saw him dream about being on. Things seemed to come kind of easily to him as watching him as a daughter, but he really wanted to be part of the Duke Endowment because he knew the Duke Endowment was so important to South Carolina and North Carolina in its various philanthropic efforts, and he really wanted to be part of that and was so excited to be a part of it. And I also want to say that probably one of my most important moments as an adult was coming with my dad to a meeting of the Duke Endowment when it wasn't in this building, but was a couple blocks away downtown, to participate in a discussion about higher education, because it was when he and I could really see eye to eye in talking about some of the main things I was thinking about and he was thinking about in higher education. And it is incredibly important to me that I had that moment, and I really appreciate the Duke Endowment providing that for me, and then providing this moment also for us to listen. So I hope we will enjoy the conversation tonight. I really thank our speakers for being here. And now I want to welcome Chris William to be our moderator. Thank you.
Wow. Susan, Sue, family, I say this to you directly. One of the tenets of me personally, I don't know, since the crust of the earth has cooled for me, has been this idea that seeking answers is certainly important, but not being afraid to ask questions is more important. Some questions don't have answers, but just asking a question opens your mind to a new possibility. Might be uncomfortable, might not be what you want to hear, but it does stretch us. So I'd like to welcome you all here. I'd like to thank Gene Cochran for asking me to come. I am honored to be here, not just in the auspices of and the shadow of the Williams family, but also within the Duke Endowment in this whole idea of going to the root cause and why do things happen the way they do? What are the issues that we need to focus on? And tonight, what about diversity and inclusion? And I might say, as Neil would ask, how do organizations establish a culture where differences are valued and leveraged for meaningful impact? Well, let's meet our panel here, and I'll do it very quickly. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. Any of you remember from the 70s and the 80s Phil Donahue? Yeah, I'm going to try that tonight. I'm not going to just try it, I'm going to do it. So the point is, I'm going to be moving around, and I expect questions and answers, and if we don't get questions, then I'll have to call on you. And I know a lot of you are not shy in retiring Jack Cecil, Charlie Lucas, but we will get a dialogue going nonetheless. So let's meet our panelists up here. Stellar folks, had a wonderful dialogue on the phone. I think we probably could have talked for about an hour. Ladies before gentlemen, and let me introduce to you the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Duke Energy. She is responsible for the governance and oversight of strategies and initiatives, which, and I highlighted this, and remember this in the dialogue in your questions, to drive the integration of diversity and inclusion in business. And next, we're just glad to have him here from California, and one of the things he said to me tonight was, I'm just glad to be in a state that actually has water. I love that about our guest. He is the Chancellor for Health Affairs at Duke University, the President and the CEO of the Duke University Health System, Dr. Jean Washington, and also Ms. LaTanya King. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to have you here.
Thank you.
LaTanya, and I might, if you don't mind me saying this, your husband Richard and your very handsome son Jordan are here. Jordan,
Yes.
could you raise your hand? Because he's 16 going on about 26.
Yeah.
He's a handsome man, and I know you're going to probably want to get engaged into this, Jordan. LaTanya, let's start with you. You know, we throw these, we get these pithy comments and these pithy words like D&I and diversity and inclusion. What is it exactly? What does D&I mean to Duke Energy? But maybe more broadly, what does it mean to an organization in your words?
I think that's a good question. So we tend to sort of let it roll off our tongues, D&I, D&I, D&I. And I like to think about it in two terms. There are two different definitions. You know, so diversity in my world as a D&I practitioner, I characterize it or define it as the mix, right? So all those things that we bring to the table, all of those things that are similar and different, right? And that's the mix. And then inclusion is about the work environment. So making that mix work. Very simply, it's about the culture, it's about the work environment, the workplace, how people feel about their work environment. And so that is inclusion.
Gene, what about you? As an academic, as a CEO of a health system now, as a student, as an educator, I mean, how does this flow over you?
Yeah, we too tend to segregate them into two different categories. The diversity one for us has evolved over the years. Many of you have followed what's happened just in terms of laws around diversity as it relates to admissions, particularly for medical schools, but also for colleges. And so it's evolved from diversity where we focused early on demographics, mostly about race and ethnicity, then to gender. But now we've moved beyond just the demographics along gender and race, ethnicity. Socioeconomic status is very important to us. And so the diversity is about differences, but differences not just in people in terms of how they look and their background, but also we're looking for different experiences and or backgrounds. And we're looking for different points of view. Given that we're an academic institution, we feel that that's the way, in fact, we sharpen our thinking and the intellect in the community. So the diversity part for us, when we say it, pretty broadly means more than just people. It means ideas and experiences and how do we get at them. The second part is very similar to what Tanya said. It's about the environment, but beyond creating the environment, the only way that we really know that we've succeeded is the degree to which people feel that they're engaged and that they're valued and that they're thriving at an individual level, up and down the organization.
LaTanya, let's go to the easy question. How do you characterize diversity and inclusiveness against the backdrop of the decades-old dialogue that we've had around affirmative action? How does it not get couched in that?
Yeah, so you said that was the easy question. That's
Yeah.
probably
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
that is probably the most difficult part of my work. You know, this evolution is what I like to call it. This evolution from a compliance-based or compliance-focused effort, you know, going back to the 60s with the Civil Rights Act to where we are today. It's been an evolution. Sometimes D&I, or diversity and inclusion, is kind of code, if you will, for what we really mean. And so that's probably the biggest challenge in this space, particularly when you get into discussions around how you increase your representation, you know, hire more folks, retain more diversity, if you will. And so we tend to default to that very safe place, that regulatory environment around compliance. And it's much broader than that.
So, you know, you talk about compliance in a bank, and people's, you know, their hair will curl. They will feel that they have to do something. So how does D&I? Let's just use that term. How does D&I? How do you? And Gene, I'd like you to weigh in on this as well.
Sure.
How does it become more than a compliant part of the business? I mean, how do you really sell it to a lineman or that division at Duke Energy?
So for us at Duke Energy, it starts with, first of all, understanding how D&I is a part of the culture of the organization. And that, of course, starts at the top of the company, you know, with our CEO and the senior leadership team. they set the tone for what the culture of the company is, how we define that. And there are some, I would say, non-negotiables in terms of certainly safety, but respect, collaboration, and trust. And so we link diversity and inclusion to those sort of baseline attributes around our culture. Beyond that, we have a business case for D&I. And so it's not just because it's the right thing to do. You know, there is a business benefit to the companies that focus on this. And there are lots of studies and research out there about how companies who have a strong focus on diversity and inclusion outperform those that do not. And so making the case for D&I is critical for an organization. I also want to say that, you know, when we started this journey many years ago at Duke Energy, a lot of the focus was on, well, let's just learn about different cultures. Let's have the bake-offs, you know, the cookbook. Everybody's done a cookbook, right? Let's have the Cultural Awareness Month. And, you know, those are great. And I think that's sort of level one for work in this space. But for companies to really realize a return, they need to really get at what are the barriers to diversity and inclusion for their organization. How do you address those? Having conversations like this where you're asking the tough questions, being brave, as Susan, I don't see her in the audience, but Susan put it, being brave to go there, to really challenge your status quo. What are those barriers to D&I in your organization and addressing those?
Dr. Washington?
Okay. First of all, I would say, you know, one of the benefits of participating in a forum like this is that you learn new terminology. I will confess, if you had asked me what D&I was outside, I would not have known. We don't use this terminology in our world. It's really just a reflection of the two different worlds. We tend to think of it more broadly as people and environment, recognizing that the environment part has definitely the inclusion as part of it. The similarity is that we believe also in our organization it starts at the top in terms of our leadership. And fortunately, for the most part, in healthcare and academia, we've moved beyond the compliance aspect. That's kind of is given. We kind of know that there are regulatory requirements, and we don't tend to talk about them. There's somebody that's in charge of the office of, but I mean, it's done. It's going to get checked. That's kind of the easier part. The tougher part is what we're talking about now, is how we diffuse a sense throughout the organization that even though we're at the top, the leadership values it, that it really is important. Again, I think it's a little easier for us in health and healthcare because we tie it to our mission. And so, you know, we have research, we have education. At the end of the day, most of what we do adds up to how are we going to help take care of patients in healthcare. And it's quite simple. We know the data are pretty strong that in healthcare, there's a direct correlation between the diversity of the workforce. And I don't just mean people. I'm talking about in terms of background, I'm talking about language differences, and the actual health outcomes. So we can start at the point of, for you to do your job effectively as an institution and enterprise, we've got to have a diversity at every level, from training all the way through, from students to residents, as well as it's the same with research when it comes to the questions that we're going to have to deal with. But beyond that, what's really important is that we talk the talk, but then we walk the walk, and so that we recognize it in the form of prizes, that we actually have some goals. We don't call them quotas, but we have goals that we establish for ourselves for the kinds of perspectives that we want in our organization and the kinds of people. And we're pretty explicit about them. Again, without them being strict. But when we are public about that with our organization and allow them an opportunity to challenge us, we grow, but we're sending the message that it's important. And then we find ways to recognize it publicly.
Questions, comments? Just raise your hand. I'll do my best to hustle over to you as quickly as I can. Okay, one right over there. No, you did not sit in the wrong seat. I stood in the wrong place. Hold on one second. Pardon me. Your name, please, and your question.
Patty Morton, and I'm trying to get my arms around the process that institutions have to develop to be able to address this, because this isn't a one generation, or perhaps it is a one generation, but give us a sense of what you need to have in place. You said training, and I understand goals, but give us some more concrete insights into what has to happen within your organizations to make this really permeate the fabric of your institutions.
Okay.
I'll let them decide.
Shall I go?
Sure. The great question. I think baseline, and this is where I think organizations can get tripped up a bit, you know. And I was on a call just early this week from someone wanting to do some work with another utility, and hadn't had a discussion or done any kind of assessment or gotten any feedback from the senior leaders in the organization. And so from a process standpoint, if you want to be able to step through this, the very first thing you got to do is have a discussion and really make the case, if you will, with the CEO of the organization. I think that is where this work starts. You can do some great work from a grassroots perspective, but in order for it to be a part of the fabric and the culture of your organizations, it's got to start with the top of the house. I think from there, once you have a sense for where the CEO of your organization stands and what he or she sees as a focus area for the organization, then you can begin the work. You got to understand kind of what is the vision for that CEO, what is that person's hot button, if you will, kind of where do they see the gaps or the potential for your line of business. And then do an assessment to understand, well, now this is, where are we in reality? Because there could be a huge gap in terms of reality versus that vision for the CEO and the Office of D&I versus where you're trying to get to. And so it's going to be important to understand. And, there are tools out there that you can leverage for that purpose. Many organizations have employee engagement surveys. That's a great place to start. For information about how your organization feels about diversity and inclusion. You can take that data from the survey and slice and dice it, by demographic group, or certainly ask within that survey questions around diversity and inclusion to be able to get at kind of, what's the current state for your organization.
LaTanya, let's stay with you just a second. And Jean, we're going to give you a chance because I want you to weigh in on what your colleagues, or what you've heard about your colleagues. So statistically, is it driven by grassroots, or is it something you have to convince, that's not the right word, but do you have to convince a chief executive, listen, look at the performance according to X and Y on D&I. How do you approach that?
Gosh, another great question. So my current CEO has a financial background, right? And so the first question she asked me when we had a chance to talk about D&I was, what's the ROI, right? So from her perspective, having that financial background, that's her interest. I've worked with previous CEOs that have had different experiences growing up, through college and, early career, and those experiences centered around race. And so this particular CEO was very interested in how are we doing as an organization around that topic. And so, again, it's very important to get aligned with the CEO because you want a champion and an advocate for the work, right? You want your CEO and the leadership team engaged. And there's enough of that, to go around in terms of opportunity in our organizations, but it's going to be critical that you're focusing on things that matter to the top of the house. There's an old adage, kind of what your leader's interested in, you're excited about, or something of that nature. Critical.
Jean, do you get, with your colleagues, how does this start with them? I mean, obviously you're an acolyte, you believe this.
Right.
How do some of your colleagues come down on this?
They tend not to tell me if they, since I make it clear what I believe. No, trust me, in academia, our colleagues tell you exactly what's on their mind. But fortunately, I came into an organization that already embraces this. And so I give a great deal of credit to my predecessors who obviously would have had to evaluate it, because I agree with LaTanya completely that it's from the top. I also agree that you've got to get a baseline assessment. But in our organization, we take it a step further. We have something we call the work culture survey. And it's in our metrics for our incentive pay. So we can look at it by unit. And payer side, I've found my colleagues and those in leadership to be very competitive around, because we make them public at the leadership level. So payer side, you don't want your unit to be an outlier when it comes to, because these are now down in the trenches. These are the everyday people who are saying what is work life for them. And you can quibble with the metrics, and we'll improve them next year because we don't always get it right. But this is another example to me of really, talking the talk, but also walking the walk and ensuring that you value. And so for the people down in the organization, just because we ask the question and they know that the leadership and their leaders are going to be held accountable, that in itself is saying, empowering them in some kind of ways to just speak up. And so across the organization, you get improvement when you've got data that you can work with.
We've got a question over here. Then I see Gene here, and we've got Lee Kiesler up here. So if you will, your name and a question.
Sure. Richard Riddell, from one of the institutions that this Duke Endowment supports. So I guess my question has to do with, let's say you've got that commitment at the top, you can describe it. But then and I'm in a higher education institution where you have young people who are communicating a lot on social media, which can be anonymous and it can be somewhat free form, and things get said. So that's one point. The other point is, I think Gene kind of referenced this. There's certain large categories in a way we've done a good job on, but there's things like implicit bias that everybody carries around with them, that from an institutional standpoint, it's kind of a challenge to figure out how you best engage those questions, both the anonymity of social media and the implicit bias that they all have. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Lots. So that is unconscious bias is a very interesting topic for me. And I think that's going to help all of our organizations really just crack the code on really advancing this work. When you no longer need my role in the organization, that's when we have really cracked the code on this. So for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, implicit or unconscious bias, this is kind of, how your history, how your experience, how your upbringing, all of that has shaped your just kind of automatic thinking and opinions about another person or about a situation, right? This is your knee-jerk reaction. I love to tell this story when I do training at Duke Energy around D&I for new leaders. And this conversation that I had with my oldest son, who's now a young adult, but I remember him coming home from school, not realizing that I was at home working that day, and he came in, and we lived in Raleigh at the time, and in a suburban area, very diverse neighborhood, but he came in one day with his pants sagging, and I about had a conniption. You know what a conniption? You know what a conniption is? I had a fit.
Yeah.
And but my immediate knee-jerk reaction was, my perception of, what he represented, right? And I know he didn't leave the house that way. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example of implicit or unconscious bias, that kind of how you react, not even consciously thinking about, what you're experiencing. And so I think that's going to help us crack the code, if you will, in organizations to be able to advance this work and do, and really just grow in this area. Where I think it shows up for us at Duke Energy, oftentimes it shows up in the interview process. We look at data in terms of our applicant flow, okay? And so we have Compliance Plus, we're a federal contractor, and so we have our affirmative action placement goals and things that we're required to do by law. And from where I sit, I like to call it Compliance Plus, so it's more than just that. And so we look at our applicant flow information, and we know the demographics of the candidates that are applying for positions. We know how they progress through each step of the process, and you can just kind of pump the brakes when you get to the interview, okay? When you look at the demographic mix of the folks who make it through the selection process, we see a steep decline in terms of the applicants that are successful at the interview stage versus that phone screen, the application, that phone screen, that testing, et cetera. And so it's begging the question, you know, kind of, well, what does that interview process look like? Who's at the table, right? Who's conducting the interview? What kinds of questions are they being asked, right? Who's a part of that overall selection process? And in every case, and you know, you might expect this because of the demographics of my organization, but in every case, what I've seen is the folks making the decisions are the folks in the majority. Okay, and so that's an example of where we see unconscious, I believe, unconscious biases at play. All right. And so what we do know is that generally, you know, we are attracted to and we're drawn to people who are like us. Okay? And that's not wrong. That's not bad, right? But it does show some decline in terms of our success around hiring when that's at play.
So how do you, and Dr. Washington, right to LaTanya's point then, how do you command compliance instead of demand compliance? How do you lead in that way instead of, as you said, well, the guy or the gal that's running that other division, they're already compliant to whatever the D&I better get on board. I mean, how do you make it more of a, you know, make it their idea, that they want to do it?
Yeah. First of all, again, this is important in our world. We don't think of it as compliance, which is just not in our worldview right now. It wasn't in my previous two institutions. This is, academia is, you know, people say it's a world apart.
And not to interrupt you, but you're in a different world. You're in healthcare and academics.
Yeah.
What if you're in a not-for-profit or a for-profit corporation? I mean, maybe that's not a fair question to
Yeah,
ask you,
because
but
I have no experience
Yeah.
there, so I can't relate to that. I do want to pick up on the question of Richard, because he actually asked two questions, whether he was intended to or not, but one of them had to do with the implicit bias, which, and I agree with LaTanya. But the other was this idea of what goes on social media and some things that kids will say. I happen to believe that those are teachable moments. And so I don't get quite as upset when I hear that some students say something that upset some other students. That's education. You know, that's what you're there for, is to learn. And more often than not, when I've been close enough to those situations, both sides came out better in terms of having gained insight from why someone said something, and the other side from why someone was offended by it and or hurt. And it should be taking place at this stage. When it's taking place at this stage during these formative years, it just gives me hope that when they get into the workplace and other settings, then we won't have to take them through sensitivity training, which is what we have to do quite a bit of in medicine, because our most prominent area of implicit bias is in patient care. When the patient walks through the door, just what you just said, regardless of your background as a provider, you know, that first look defines how you're going to treat that patient.
You've been very patient, Gene. Do you have a question? Then we're going to come up here to Lee Kiesler.
A really continuation, I think, of the conversation that Patty started. And this pertains probably more to LaTanya than to Gene. But my experience with a large for-profit organization and 3 CEOs, all of whom had, I think, the right sensibilities, but it wasn't until the third person tied the progress of the company to salary and bonus that we really saw an appropriate workforce that changed. What are your thoughts about that? And Gene, if you did want to weigh in, I'd be
Sure.
happy to hear.
Yeah, yes, you know, let's do it. The, you know, what gets measured gets done. It's as simple as that. There's not been, in recent years, an appetite for doing that at Duke Energy. I don't know that we've not teed the question up, within the past couple years, but I agree with that. There are many organizations. I pay attention to and do a lot of benchmarking with other organizations, and I see companies that do this well, that get results, that get returns for their organizations. That's a key component. There's a lot of transparency around how they're doing. They have scorecards. The board of directors is heavily involved in reviewing the performance around diversity and inclusion overall, and management incentives are tied to progress. Now, what I will say, always caution, because we are a very compliant organization, right? And you set a goal, we're going to achieve it. What we don't want to do, of course, is incent the wrong behaviors, because that will fail miserably, right? But yeah, I'm all about, taking that approach in order to get results. Someone else, to piggyback on an earlier question around sort of the process, and it was a question around the focus from the top of the organization. It's not either or. There's got to be a strong grassroots approach as well. You can't just mandate things be done and have that messaging from the CEO without engaging, of course, the workforce. And so we do a lot of work around getting our employees engaged in this work from a grassroots perspective. Like many organizations, we have employee resource groups. We have local diversity and inclusion councils, and a very strong volunteer program where employees get involved in the communities and things that are of interest to them. And so all of that helps to build this culture of inclusion so employees are able to participate and really contribute to the company's success.
Dr. Washington, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, nothing to add on this one. I already indicated that we have a performance-based system that responds to workforce culture, where we have targets there, and we have outliers, and you are not rewarded. It would be putting it mildly. We don't have such targets as it relates to the diversity question. We tackle that differently. We have a management team, and down through the organization, in a meeting with me and with other senior leaders, we know how many of our top positions, so for example, and in a given year, we know how many we expect are going to be open. So we have a target in that sense, but we're holding all of ourselves accountable for how we're going to drive that forward. We don't delegate that down further in the organization, and it's not related to the incentives.
Lee, Nate, question?
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Sure.
I'm Lee Kiesler with Library System here in Charlotte, and the questions for both of them. Each of you has obviously been very successful in your careers, and what I'd like to ask you to do is to think about, was there someone along the way who perhaps has a different background than yours, who took a chance on you, and what was it about that person that you remember today as being distinctive and insightful about helping you along the way?
It's a long list for me. The most recent one is Duke, taking a chance on me about me here. If I go back, my personal story is I grew up in segregated Houston. So all the way through high school, it was segregated, water fountains, everything. So, I often say I benefited from that because it was a very nurturing community. I was a part of W.B. Du Bois's Talented 10th. So I got that extra dose after school that was preparing me for some kind of leadership role. They didn't envision that, I would be out because it was a segregated community. So I can't say that it was there because, and then I went away to Howard, which was predominantly black or, African American. And so it really wasn't until later, and I would say, it started at the level of a medical school. I went to a medical school where prior to the year I was accepted along with, I think, 6 other blacks. I'm not sure they had 6 or 7 in 50 or 40 years. But this was a time of affirmative action, and I'll be candid. I benefited from this movement. I didn't think I was any more super than all of the other African Americans, or for that matter, women that had applied in the previous 100-year history of this institution. So I would say that someone took a chance then. Someone, in fact, the person who interviewed me was a guy named John Watson, who was an African American professor, the only one, who in fact organized the maintenance workers and others at this particular hospital to say, we've been working here, and the only African Americans we see are the ones, who are cleaning up the place. We want to have more students. So in many regards, that was a turning point for me and for my life and my career. And it represented, now that I think about it, a kind of grassroots effort, but having one person there. But even with that, it represented someone at the leadership role. At this point, the particular chancellor of this institution, his name was Phil Lee. Some of you know the name. He actually became Secretary of Health back in the Johnson administration. Decided they were going to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you for the question. There are probably, in my 28-year career with Duke Energy, many people that have taken a chance on this little girl. I started with the company way back in 1988 in St. Petersburg, and really didn't spend a lot of time, trying to inform or shape my career. I was able to live and work in the same community, and it paid well, and I was happy to be there. And over the years, I began to just really show an interest and grew my career in the EEO compliance space, and found myself in an HR business partner role where I dabbled a little bit in diversity, supporting the CEO, and this was in Florida at the time. And from there, I was able to get exposure, not by any design on my part, just by nature of the job. And I was given an opportunity in 2006. I was asked, very first time in my career, asked to consider a new role in the organization. And took a chance and moved my family to Raleigh. And from there, my career just really took off. Probably most notable to get to your specific question about the one person, again, and many, but I could remember my former CEO, white male, and being in a position to really needing to lean on him on a particular issue. And so I was like, okay, well, let's put his money where his mouth is, and I had an issue. I shot off an email to say, hey, this issue is happening, and I need your support for X. And he flat out said, I don't agree with you, LaTanya. And I thought, okay, probably career limiting. He said, but come see me, let's have a conversation. Okay, and the come see me was, come see me now. I'm in my office now. Come have a conversation. And for me, that was writing down from the 20th floor down to like the 11th floor in downtown Raleigh. And I thought, oh boy. But I went in and had this conversation with my CEO at the time, and he says, well, let me hear what's on your mind about this particular issue. And it had to do with how Hispanics were represented in an article on our portal. And so I shared my perspective, and his response was, I stand corrected. Thank you for your insight. I didn't think about it that way. For me, the turning point in terms of me doing this work was having his ear, having a very non-threatening conversation about a tough topic, and him listening to me listening to him, and from there we were able to make progress. And it gave me an opportunity to really demonstrate, again, I got to find Susan in the room, bravery in this space. Back to what your dad, tried to instill around, at least having the conversation. And so that was it for me, sitting across the desk from my white male CEO, having what I thought was going to be seemingly a difficult conversation, has really been a turning point for me in doing this work.
Well, it seems like we are exactly in the place for that. When James B. Duke decided to seed the endowment and to make some change in the Carolinas and decide where that money was going to go. I do wonder, and I look at you, Russell Robinson, and I do wonder what James B. Duke, would think about diversity and inclusion. Do you mind?
Not at all.
I'll hold on to it.
No, I can get it. I think, as my colleague and dear friend Neil Williams surely knew, it is quite clear how Mr. Duke would have felt about all of this, not only from what he provided in the indenture that created the Duke Endowment, but in the way he lived his life. The indenture, he was way ahead of his time. In the early part of the last pre-1920s. The indenture first provides that Duke University, which he created, would have not only men but women. And that was really a novel idea at that time, that women would be educated in the same way and on the same level that men were. That was a novel idea, rarely if put into effect at any time with that. So that, and then also on the racial basis, not only did he select as one of his 4 higher education schools a historically black university as a beneficiary, but he also provided in other provisions with respect to other institutions, child care, for example, that they would be institutions which he said in the language of the day would be for white or colored, explicitly that. So he was very clear on that. And he was also, in those days when the Democrat Party was the white supremacy party, and aggressively so, he was a Republican. And he was attacked really viciously by the grandfather of a very dear friend of mine for his position on. It wasn't so explicit on that, but it was implicit in all of the attack on him for that. So it is quite clear that he would have been very good. And it is, I think, symbolic that Duke University, the most prominent architect of Duke University, that it was a black architect. So that is part of the Duke University's DNA, as Dr. Washington mentioned earlier. And it is a heritage that it is part of our DNA at the Duke Endowment. It's a heritage that we are very proud of. And I think the Bassett Affair at Duke University is another example of that. But as to the Duke Endowment, John Hope Franklin served as a trustee into his 90s. And he really instilled in us the realization, the notion that although we have come a long way, we still got a long way to go. And that was, so it is a part of the DNA of the Duke Endowment too, and we are very proud of that heritage.
Okay. Well said.
Well said.
So I wonder, what do you think gets lost in the dialogue when we talk about diversity and inclusion? What do you think we miss entirely when we focus on, I hate to use this term, quotas or return on investment, or, you know, I guess I feel like I'm being compelled to do it because I have to do it, and yeah, it does make sense, but where do you think, 10 years from now, better question, 10 or 20 years from now, Dr. Washington, what do you think we're going to say when we look back on this time about D&I?
Yeah, okay. Seriously, we tend to separate the concept. I mean, they are definitely inextricably intertwined. But when I talk about our work culture surveys, that's not about any color or gender. That's about the whole community. And everybody in our organization rallies around that. I don't just mean leadership. People know we're sensitive to it. And so we have people in our organization who are agnostic about diversity. But we have uniformity around the notion of the workplace, this sense that you are engaged and can be engaged and you can thrive is a basic right. And so that's one of the reasons why we've separated, because we feel when they're put in the same category, when they're not completely overlap, we confuse them sometimes when we don't separate them. So I think that the diversity part is a little easier, even though it's hard, but it's a little easier because it's concrete, and it's a little bit more straightforward, and it's a little easier to measure. The inclusion part is like climate. That's the other word that we use for it. And climate is kind of ethereal, and it is just hard to get to. So I would say 20 years from now, I'm hopeful that we'll be where we are with climate, where at least we are in terms of understanding. We still have a great deal of work to do relative to diversity, unquestionably. Like you just say, Russell. We've done well at Duke, but we have a great deal more work to do as it relates to it. I think we have even more work to do as it relates to inclusion in climate, because there I think we're talking about an even larger population, and it's less tangible.
Really? Latanya, you agree with that? You think there's more work on the inclusion side than diversity?
Well, I think, diversity is already here, right? So the graying of America, right? Our country, it's already mixed. And so I think where the real work needs to happen is with us individually. I always like to say that I am on a journey myself, right? And so, I show up, this little black girl from St. Petersburg, Florida, with those experiences that I've had, with what my mom, a single parent, taught me, right? What my dad, not being there, taught me, being poor, what that's taught me, not having gone on, like many of you in the room, for higher education, what that's taught me, right? I show up with that in the workplace. And there's a book a small little handbook written by Mary Frances Winters called Inclusion Starts with I. And this book gives you some very practical things to consider, food for thought, nice quotes around really understanding where you are personally on your D&I journey, right? And so each of us are in a different place on that journey. So 10 years from now, what I'd like to see is, first of all, that organizations no longer need a chief diversity officer, right? No longer need an office of D&I, right? That we've got that down pat, right? So working myself out of a job. Secondly, is that there's a lot of courage around having the conversation, and that once we understand where we are on our personal journeys, that we are interested and really hungry to know and learn more about somebody else that's different. For me right now, I can tell you what I'm working on. I'm working on my comfort with working with people with disabilities. Last year my focus was working with people who are in the LGBT community. Just not an area that I am familiar with at that point. I hadn't had that experience, that exposure. And so I have placed myself very intentionally in situations where I can learn and grow, right? And so what I like to see, not 10 years from now, but maybe tomorrow, all of us challenging ourselves in that way, right? If you are a little bit uncomfortable, that means that you're in a position to be learning. Okay, and that's what it's going to take.
We have, right over here, Charity, if you can. We've got about 10, 15 minutes on the outside to take more questions. Sue, I'll come up there. Go ahead. Who was I going to call on you?
You were going to call on me.
Yeah, oh, yeah, I'm sorry, Jack. Please. Okay.
You almost answered my question. I was thinking on a 1 to 10 scale, if this takes us 100 years to come where we are now, I hope it doesn't take 100 years to go all the way to 10. Thanks. You almost answered, we don't have a D&I office.
All right.
And part of my homework for this session tonight, I asked, we have 4 sons, and I asked our 17-year-old, I said, how do you react in environments that I don't know if you're Chinese or Japanese or Russian or white. I just
I love
Maybe
it,
walk us
yeah.
I hope it's not 100.
Yeah.
How can we move the states and the broader community along with success rather than just some people?
I think, and I like that answer as well, and I can remember actually loving to hear that answer. I don't see color. That was like, used to be music to my ears, you know? But as I've grown in this space, actually, I want you to see my color and my gender, right? And what I bring to the table. I want you to recognize my difference, okay? And understand my difference and respect that. And so I think it's great that that's the lens that people have, but that then suggests that we are all the same. I don't see color, I don't see age, I don't see your abilities or disabilities, right? I don't see your sexual orientation, that we're all the same, and that's not true. And so what we want is people to recognize that difference that we bring to the table, understand it, and then leverage that so that our organizations grow.
Gene?
Yeah. I don't think it will take us 100 years to go as far as we've certainly gone in the last 100 years. But again, putting this in a medical context, I kind of think of this as the quality pursuit. We never get there. You know, it's like getting for perfection in healthcare, but we're always striving to get better. And what I'd want to see in 10 years, because the differences are going to be there, and there'll be new differences. If we look around the world, that there are conflicts that have been going on,
Right.
you know, for a couple of thousands of years, and so that's going to exist. But that we continue to improve in how we resolve conflict and how we anticipate and begin to create environments that at least facilitate the transitions that take place when there are differences that are going to occur over a period of time. And so that we actually have a greater clarity, which I don't think we do after all these years, about how we really get our arms around it and make it more manageable and anticipate them and manage groups through periods where differences are going to be on the table.
We're going to go back there, and Susan, you're going to have the last question and the last comment.
Hello, my name is Rakita Harvey, and my question is around the retention piece of D&I. I know a lot of organizations focus on D&I, and you increase your diversity numbers in the new hires, but the retention piece is a concern because of the inclusive work environment. And so a lot of times organizations look at the metrics, and you determine certain target focus groups that cause concerns, and you implement programs. The question is, how do you measure success? Because in my organization, it's similar to what you said, it's like climbing.
Mm-hmm.
We look at the numbers, and they change each year. The engagement surveys are usually anonymous, and for so many legal reasons, we never know, you know, what group said what. So you look at the metrics. But how is success determined when you spend all of this time creating these programs to help those target groups? How do you know if it's helping your organization and helping your workplace become more inclusive?
Sure. In our case, and we're not there yet, but we're increasingly trying to determine why every individual leaves, regardless of gender or regardless of race, ethnicity. And in general, I mean, the responses fall into three categories. You know, one is it's quite often it's a better professional opportunity. It can be more pay, it can be a promotion that we weren't ready to provide because there was no position. That's common. Another big category, which we can't control all of, so it's personal. You know, spouse, a new spouse, it can be some person, moving closer to my parents. The third category is the group that we want to learn more from, and because it had something to do with the work environment. It had something to do with us not delivering. And the idea would be longer term that we'd see that percent go down, and we see it going down because if we can really titrate this right, and we're not there, that we will become more expert at addressing the needs of a larger and larger group of people who are in our community, who are feeling that they are not valued and that they are not thriving and therefore are better off leaving.
Latonya, do you have a rigorous exit debrief, same way? You kind of tweeze out why folks?
Yeah, so we do that like many organizations, exit interviews, right, to find out why people chose to leave. We've concluded that, most people don't want to burn bridges, and so, there's always a question as to how much you can rely on that data. So I am taking on an initiative myself to say, why don't we have stay interviews? So let's talk to folks before they leave, to find out, what is it that we need to do to retain your employment. There's probably a more fancy word, than stay, but you get the point. I think we're asking the question much too late, once they've already accepted another opportunity or they're headed out the door. And so I think to answer your question, I think that is the first thing. I think the second piece is to get that input from those active employees and let that be the solution. As an HR professional, we are good at coming up with solutions for your line of business. We're HR and we have an answer, a solution, or a product or service for you. And so I think we owe it to our organizations to really listen to our employees, to seek that out, listen to what their thoughts are, involve them in solving for the issue, and I think that is the key to helping with retention.
Susan Williams, you have the last comment and the last question, please.
Thank you very much for your conversation.
Sure.
I wanted to just end with the phrase inclusive excellence. And I think that's a phrase my father would have liked. He liked excellence. He liked thinking about that. But my real question is, how do we put those two words together in a kind of ongoing way? And what do we do to change the definition of excellence? In my organization at Ohio State, I find a lot of times that we get, particularly on the faculty side, we get recruitment and retention efforts that are for what's called the best athlete, and often that's a pretty singular notion of what excellent is. And then there might be a diversity side on the other side of it. And then something like science, and I guess I'm wondering in particular on the Duke side, something like going from a single PI model to a team science model, where you're really changing what excellence is. How do we go about making an inclusive definition of excellence so that we're not all kind of just getting diverse really toward a single definition of what excellence is?
Yeah. That's a very good question. Excellence is defined differently by different groups, and it really does vary in the context. But it's one of those things where, you know it, particularly when you see it, and you especially know it when it's not excellent. In our academic world, part of what you're describing now is the idea that we diversify excellence as it relates. Let's just take science as an example. And that's already happening because the reality there is that in the research world, the data are very strong. Latonya alluded to this earlier, that better results stem from team-based science, where you got different investigators from different backgrounds. Well, this is a case where some of you know Francis Collins, who's the current head of NIH, and he says, in public, if you really want to hurt, the faculty members, the cat in a different direction, move the food. So they have now the grants that come out allow multiple PIs, and they have to be team-based, and they have to be multidisciplinary. And so that does tend to get it movement excellence in that regards. What I think the harder part is the broader thing of tying excellence and, quote, inclusion or diversity together. And there are some, for whatever reason, which I don't fully understand, who think quite often when you start talking about diversity, almost by definition, you're talking about compromising excellence. And I just don't understand it, so I haven't had a way to respond to that. Unfortunately, at least at our institution, it's not
a problem that's visible, and so we haven't had to address it. But I do see that as a problem that exists out there as it relates to these concepts.
Tanya?
Inclusion, excellence. So I think my response to that is, we want environments where everybody feels valued, right? And where everybody is respected so that they can reach their full potential. That's it in a nutshell. It is taken, y'all, you know what the golden rule is, right? Treat people like you want to be treated. But it's more than that. It's the platinum rule. You know what the platinum rule is? Treat people like they want to be treated, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is, how we progress towards inclusion excellence.
Thank you. Our panel, Latanya King, Dr. Jean Washington, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nice meeting you.
Thank you all so much. Chris, thank you for being an excellent moderator and for those great questions, and also for those of you here tonight who asked the questions. I appreciated that very much. And Jean and Latanya, thank you for being willing to be our panelists tonight and answer whatever question came at you, and you did a wonderful job. I can't think of a better way to honor Neil Williams than to have an event like this, asking hard questions, causing us to think, and Neil always did that with us. We always got into wonderful discussions and very strategic discussions, and this certainly is one of the more strategic discussions that we could possibly have because it's so important to everything we do. And I'm sure as you talked, we all had many questions we could have asked you, and I can't wait to get you off in a corner and talk to you a little bit. But Sue, we thank you. Susan, we thank you all so much, your whole family, for putting this whole lecture series together and for what it means to all of us to be able to do this and think about Neil and to do it this in his honor and to continue to ask those hard questions. We appreciate it very much, and the Duke Endowment is so appreciative that you have had this event here with us tonight, and thank you all. Thank you to your family very much. We all share our love for Neil Williams and for your family. Thank you very much for being here tonight, and we hope many of you will come back lots of times, and thank you. Good night.